All Heretic here. Today in the Battlegrounds, we're going to be talking about the Undead tribe. We're going to talk about the various minions, abilities, all the things we can do to make our undead work and help us get some big wins. So let's not hesitate. Let's jump right into it. First, let's talk about undead abilities we have to be concerned with. The first one is not an undead unique thing, but it's important. You have to remember that the undead have minions that have both death rattles, in some cases, reborn. Now that reborn ability can appear on minions that don't usually get reborn, can just fly all over the place from random death rattles. So you have to keep in account in your head when they're going to trigger and the order you can help that with. So sometimes if they're randomly being applied, there's only so much you can do. But in the first couple turns, as you're just getting this laid out, there's not going to be that many of them with this ability, so positioning is important. And the reason for that is the first thing that triggers on minions when they die is a death rattle, and then the reborn triggers. So if there's no room for the reborn after the death rattle goes off because you've got a way to trigger the death rattle multiple times, and suddenly there's no room for that reborn version, you just lost all that value. It's just gone. They're dead. They're not coming back. So you have to remember to position them as best you can so you get that full value. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. There's just no way you can get that value. Other times, with some lucky, sneaky positioning, you can milk out all you can and you can get an extra few minions, and that's the difference between first and eighth. The other thing undead have that is completely unique to them is the undead army aura buff. Now, there are various minions. We're going to go over that when I do the individual breakdowns of minions that will increase this buff, but this is a permanent buff that will apply to your undead minions wherever they are. Are they on your board? Great. Are they in the shop? It's there. Hey, do they come out as a death rattle or reborn? It's on them too. Did you buy a gas coiler, tripled into it? It was all you could do, so you slammed it down and then it kicked out more undead? Yep, they get it too. All of your undead benefit from the aura you give. Your opponent doesn't matter. They can play undead too. They've got their own aura to worry about. That's separate. You just buff your own aura. And this accumulative buff that if you do end up playing undead is very important, because the higher you get that, the easier it is to deal with those big chunky boards that just normally would be completely out of these minions' range. Oh, and during this video, I'm going to refer to a type of minion called tokens. And a token is any minion that is summoned during the combat that is just a tier 1, regardless of what it could have come out of. It's going to be referred to as a token, and it counts as a tier 1 for the purposes of damage. Whether it's a 400 or it's a 1/1, it's a token. All right, let's do it. Let's jump into the minions. Let's talk about the different undead minions. As always, just a reminder that if there are any changes to this, they will be attached in the comments below. Anytime there's a patch, I will, in those comments, post the changes to the different minions, since I can't edit the video directly, obviously, once it's posted. If it is worthy of a complete redo of the video, I will, of course, but typically, just a note or two. Maybe there'll be a follow-up attachment video put on the end of this, but typically the comments will be there showing the changes. And people are always encouraged to post any ideas they have for things that could make this different and, a viable strategy that we normally wouldn't have used before. And we will not go over minions that are simply stat sticks. If they just have a row of stats and they don't really do anything cool or special, not really worth talking about those. This is more about the special ones, the ones that might have a trick and something cool we can do with them. And with all that being said, let us start with the tier 2 4/1 undead Eternal Knight. Has +1/+1 for each friendly Eternal Knight that died this game, wherever this is. So this is going to be a permanent buff to all of your knights. In the board, on the shop, later when we talk about Eternal Summoner, all of them are going to benefit from this buff. So you definitely want to get this early if you're going to do it. But if you see one in the shop and there's other minions in the shop, are you going to pick it up? Well, typically no. When I will pick it up is if I see 2 of them, if I have a hero power like Lich King that allows me to reborn it, or Terran Gorfiend that allows me to trigger it, if I have another unit that might allow me to reborn this. Now I'm interested if there's only 1. Typically though, I always want 2. Anytime I see 2 of these, especially as Lich King, it's like, hey, guess what? We're tiering a whole lot. Let's put both these down, let's reborn one, and let's just go straight to 6 as fast as we reasonably can. And, well, you might lose some fights. You won't take a whole lot of damage typically unless your opponent's really high roll. And then Eternal Knights, once again, will be allowing you to pivot later into an Eternal Summoner build pretty effectively if you can find those summons. Next up, we have the tier 2 1/4 Nerubian Swarmer. Battlecry your undead have +1 attack this game, wherever they are. Now, this is one of those undead army buff minions. When you play this, it buffs them wherever they are. So, however you could trigger this Battlecry beyond playing it, do you have a Rylak? Do you have a hero power that allows you to trigger it? However you get this to trigger extra, that's more value. Typically, you're not going to see this on boards too much. It's kind of one of those cycle cards, but remember, it's not really a 1/4. It's also a 2/4 because it gives itself +1 attack permanently. The more of these you play, the more that buff's going to be. I do like Nerubian Swarmer early. Typically, I don't pick it up unless I have a couple undead minions, but if I already have a couple Risen Riders, why not throw a Nerubian Swarmer out there? It's a 2/4. Now their attack is buffed across the board. It's just good early tempo. At tier 2, not too hard to pick it up. Jumping up to tier 3, we have the Disguised Graverobber. This is a 4/4 neutral card that's only in Undead games. Battlecry, destroy a friendly undead to get a plain copy of it. Typically, it's only used to target a reborn minion if you already have 2 of them to make a triple. Just make sure you have space. Throw that out there, get the easy triple like that. Next up, we have the Hateful Hag. This is a 6/2 undead, and this is whenever this attacks, give the minion to the right of this reborn. Now, this is one of those minions that lets you reborn something you shouldn't be able to. Yeah, you can reborn any undead minion you want. You also can reborn a Leroy with it. That's not bad either. There's a lot of sneaky things you can do with this. So just whatever you're playing, if undead are in and you see a Hateful Hag, take a look at your board. One of my favorite early game targets is the Eternal Knight. Start getting that thing scaling up early. This thing helps you get there. That's a lot of easy tempo. Just remember, it has to attack to give reborn. So if it dies first, you're out of luck. But if it just swings, that's all you need to do. It doesn't need to survive attacking. It just needs to attack to give reborn. Next up, we have the 5/1 Undead Naga Vengeful Slitherer. Spellcraft, give your minions +1 health until next turn. Any that die next combat, gain it permanently. Okay, it's a 5/1, so it's got nice attack. It has no health. You want it to die because then it's going to permanently get extra health. Then again, you don't want it to die because you'd like to win your fights. And it does buff your undead health, but it's such a low amount on such a meh minion. There are times, if you're sitting there and you are at 3 gold and you don't have a full board, he's the best minion, pick him up. Otherwise, typically I would pass on the Vengeful Slitherer. Now at tier 4, now we start to have some of the fun shenanigan minions here. We can do some cool stuff here. We're going to start with the 4/3 undead Anub'arak. This is Death Rattle. Your undead have +1 attack this game wherever they are. Yes, this is the undead army aura. Permanent. All your undead, wherever they are, you can get this thing reborn, say using a hag we just mentioned. You can get multiple triggers, say using a Titus, Rivendare, and you are going to gain a ton of extra attack. Obviously, the earlier you get this, the better. But if somehow you get a hag and you reborn this and you've got a Titus, your attack is going to scale incredibly fast. Over a few turns, you're going to gain so much attack you can deal with most boards pretty effectively if you just have a bunch of summon token minions and they run wild because they all have this undead army buff. Next up for you Duos fans, we have the 2/7 undead Grave Narrator. In Avenge 3, your teammate gets a random minion of their most common type. So, teammate, just playing a normal board, say it's a dragon board, say it's a Naga board, you playing a bunch of random garbage minions that are gonna die like crazy. Hopefully a couple of them have taunt to protect the narrator. Say 15 minions die before the narrator dies. That's a lot, I understand. This is at tier 4 though, so that's not unreasonable. Means you send 5 minions, 15 gold worth of minions to your teammate for 0 gold. Just make sure he's got hand space. Just keep sending minions over there. You don't want to do this forever. Later in the game, you will be punished. You will die if you have this 2/7 on your board. I don't care if it's gold and it's a 4/14. It isn't doing anything on turn 10 typically, other than helping you finish 4th in duos. This is going to give you a lot of value and supercharge your teammate. You will get nothing from this, but your teammate, he is going to get triples into 6s. He's going to be going straight to 6. He's going to start feeding you stuff when he gets triples that he doesn't need, that turns out are great for you, or a direction you can now turn in. Definitely Grave Narrator, if you have a board that summons tokens, will love this minion. Next, we have the 5/2 Undead Mummifier. Death Rattle, give a different friendly undead reborn. You heard it right. It dies. One of your minions that normally doesn't have reborn now has reborn. Hey, maybe it had reborn, it died, but guess what? Mummifier gave it reborn again for the purposes of combat. Mummifier is a fantastic little minion in the mid game. In the late game, you're going to start using this as more of a combo piece with some of the builds we can go into potentially later. But Mummifier is a big deal because it really enables some of the later builds. So while it might not feel hugely impactful early, as you get into those late things and you start discovering minions like Kel'Thuzad, you start to see windows open that this thing allows. And now we have the minion I know you probably are very familiar with. This is a 6/3 undead dragon, the Nightbane Ignited. And you probably don't know it from playing undead. They're there, but if you see dragon boards, you definitely see this thing everywhere. Heck, maybe by the time of the end of the day today when I post it, it's already been nerfed, in which case you'll never hear this probably, but Nightbane Ignited is taunt, Death Rattle, give 2 random friendly minions this minion's attack. So with Undead, you have the Undead Army buff that is going to be hitting this and increasing its attack. And then when it dies, it's going to throw around that attack 2 times. Do you have a Titus Rivendare? However this is going off, you're throwing a lot of attack around, and it can be super useful if your army buff is high enough. So definitely Nightbane Ignited fits pretty well into an undead board as you're looking in that mid game to get strong. Definitely give you that extra attack across your minions to help carry. Jumping up to tier 5, we have some interesting undead minions also. First, we have the 2/9 undead Champion of the Primus. Avenge 3, your undead have +1 attack this game wherever they are. Once again, folks, this is the undead army buff going everywhere, but an Avenge 3 that is going to be permanently kicking out constantly if you have a lot of tokens. Now, we're going to go into different builds in a little while, and you'll see where Champion won't really fit if you've only got 7 minions that only kick out a couple minions. But if you've got a board full of token producing minions and a Champion of the Primus, if you triple in this early, you're a Galakron and you've got a good shop of just garbage tokens and you happen to hero power this, you're like sitting there going, I might just be stopping on this, because you are going to get that buff so high, so fast, that the undead really can become very hard to stop. The Champion of the Primus early, fantastic. Mid game depends on the board. Late game, typically you're always going to pass on. All right, let's dive into the now changed Hungering Abomination. This 4/5 undead has Avenge 1, gain +1/+2 permanently. So my issue with this minion is it's just kind of slow. You have to have a minion die to then gain +1/+2. No, up until very recently, it was +1/+1. +1/+2 obviously is better. I did get 2 games today in with this, and it does seem to stick around a little better than before. There is no doubt about that. But at the same time, it's still not exactly inspiring. It is certainly better than it was, and it's kind of the same use case. The earlier you get this, if you have the right kind of board, the better. But ultimately, still going to get destroyed by late game better minion. Odds are you're going to replace this even if you get it early enough, because it's just not going to compete. The raw stats it gains, while they are quite good, unless gotten incredibly early, typically just aren't enough to compete with other scaling big late game units. But it's still a very good mid game thing if you get this early enough and you have the right kind of boards, or it can definitely carry you to tier 6 to then either find more undead or a different direction altogether. Moroes, the Steward of Death. 4/2 undead, reborn Death Rattle. Give your undead +2/+4. Now, it's not a permanent buff, it's only for the duration of combat, but a 2/4 buff isn't bad. This is definitely not as powerful as it once was. It has seen a lot of changes. There is a build you can do with it we will talk about later that is effective in some lobbies. Once again, not as like it used to be, but Moroes is still an interesting card, and if you're playing undead, not bad if you get it early and you just need something to give yourself a little more stick. But once you start finding all the pieces of most of the builds, you're typically not going to want this card, but there's still times where it fits. Next up, we have a spell at tier 5, and that is the 2 gold Butchering. Destroy a friendly undead. Your undead have an extra attack equal to its tier this game. Once again, You target reborn minions with this, it will trigger and can make you triples, but the primary use for this, other than that, is going to be giving you attack if you still need it. This is going to be your undead army buff again. Have a tier 6 minion you don't need that's undead, you destroy it, you've just given 6 attack to your undead. You're in a pretty good position, or desperate, if you feel like you can just destroy your tier 6 minions all happily randomly. But hey, good for you if it's a strong position, and good luck if it's a bad one. Butchering's not a bad spell, it's just very situationally useful. You never find it when you need it, and when you find it, you're like, I don't really want to play it most of the time because you gotta kill a minion for it, but quite cheap. Now at tier 6, we have some fun undead minions. First, we have the 10/8 undead Archlich Kel'Thuzad. At the end of your turn, destroy the undead to the left of this and resummon an exact copy. Now, there's a lot of uses for Kel'Thuzad. If you happen to have a reborn minion next to him, what's going to happen is it's going to die. It has death rattle. That death rattle is going to trigger. Then the reborn version will appear, and then the original one will appear. So it's important, once again, to remember positioning, but Kel'Thuzad is one of those ways you can just, every turn, print another copy of a minion. Would you like triples? If one of them's got reborn, doesn't matter, you triple it, they're all going to have all their stats, everything back again. So you're not getting weaker versions of the minions overall. Don't concern yourself with that. Just be happy you're making triples. Now, what cards do you want to kill with this? Obviously, things like Mummifier can be fantastic because it's happening at the end of your shock phase. That reborn that's moving to a random minion is permanent. Permanent reborn being kicked around your board is pretty awesome. You have a Titus Rivendare. Now it's triggering twice in your shock phase, and then it's triggering twice in the combat phase. You're going to get to a point where now you no longer need the Mummifier because everything's got reborn, and you're good. You can kick it, replace it with something better. That is one of the neat things about Kel'Thuzad. You can take these utility minions, kill them a few times, give your minions the abilities, then kick the minion you no longer need. It's pretty awesome. Use it on Eternal Knights. Make them just get the buff off that. Have you reborned an Eternal Knight? Do you want to summon more Eternal Knights? My favorite trick, it's annoying, it's not great, but it's fun when you don't find the Eternal Summoner. Get a board full of reborn Eternal Knights. Just go for a board of them. Just let them go nuts. Every time one dies, they're buffing each other 2/2. It feels pretty good. It's funny to do, and it can win fights, and it's just a good goofy thing to do because nobody expects it. Next up, we have the 4/11 Undead Beast Deadstomper. After you summon a minion in combat, give your minions +3 attack. Once again, not a permanent buff, but if you have a ton of tokens, if you're summoning a bunch of minions and you need more attack, is your undead army not high? Are you playing a different menagerie board? Deadstomper works with anything because you just need to have things that summon minions. And then Deadstomper says, great, here's attack for everybody. Not permanent, who cares? Just across the board, 3 attack every time you summon something. Did you summon 20 guys? 60 attack across the board. It's really good with the right kind of board. Deadstomper, keep an eye out for it if you're running tokens. Next up, we have the 8/1 Undead Eternal Summoner. Reborn, Death Rattle, summon 1 Eternal Knight. Now, the Eternal Knight you summon is not permanent. It goes away at the end of the turn. But remember, when Eternal Knights die, their buff is permanent. So have you had Eternal Knights dying the entire game? Okay. Well, guess what? Whatever that buff is, be it +5 or +50, all the knights you summon have that buff. Oh, have you buffed your undead army? Well, we also have to attach that buff on top of the Eternal Knight buff. So yeah, they can get really big really fast. Remember, it has Reborn and Death Rattle. So if it dies and there's no room, say you have it in slot 1 and it dies, it's going to summon the Eternal Knight and there's no room for that Reborn Eternal Summoner, so it's just gone. Don't waste it. Make sure you position as best you can. Make sure you get their health above 3. Typically, you don't have to worry too much about getting double Tunnel Blastered, but if you do, you want them above 6. It's very common, easy way to shut down a weak undead board. They can have 1,000 attack, but if they all have 1 health, Tunnel Blast them and they all die. But if you buff up that health just enough to make people have to work for it, it might make their board weak. Trying to counter your board with stuff like this And then you just overwhelm them with tokens because they didn't get their Tunnel Blasters triggers high enough to make a difference. Another thing, Archlich Kel'Thuzad is a lot of fun with Eternal Summoner. Remember what I said about summoning a board full of Eternal Knights? A board full of Eternal Summoners. Just make sure you leave room for that Death Rattle, then the Reborn, then the normal version that gets summoned when you're using this with Eternal Summoner. Yeah, you have to think about all those triggers. And if you have a Titus Rivendare, remember the double Death Rattle, then you have to worry about the Reborn version. Then you have to worry about the new one. I say cut Titus if you're going to do that build, but typically I do like Rivendare on a board full of summoners. So it really depends how you want to, what chances you want to take and what build you want to do. I just wouldn't keep Kel'Thuzad going too long. Once you start printing gold Eternal Summoners, you're all set. Because an important note I might not have mentioned while I was talking about Kel'Thuzad, if you print out a copy that's gold, that's been reborn, say you had an Eternal Summoner that was gold, and then you make an extra one, that reborn one that's permanent will still be gold. So more Kel'Thuzad value. I probably should have mentioned with Kel if I didn't. And they also very recently changed Sister Deathwhisperer now. The 5/9 undead. After a friendly minion is reborn, give your minions +1/+3 permanently. So, a couple things about this. Now, in your typical undead board, you have many reborn minions. This is going to help get those base stats up. If you get this early and you have a bunch of reborns, you really can scale your board to the moon. Late game, if this isn't too excessively big, I will cut this. Typically, the stats it's giving aren't going to be enough. The stats it's giving are just a nice baseline to get you to avoid some of the basic counters undead have to deal with, just allowing you to deal with smaller minions, and then your aura gets big enough where all your summons will kill things. Deathwhisperer is just giving you raw stats, and typically you don't need them too long, so I'll usually cut this. But there is another interesting use case we haven't got to explore yet, because I haven't got to play a game since they changed this just yesterday from when I'm recording this, and that is, it buffs your minions +1/+3. Not undead. It used to be undead minions. It is now minions. So this can work in conjunction with a lot of different potential boards. You could definitely throw this into a menagerie build. And there are ways where we can build this out. I'm going to experiment more with this, and this will probably go into more of a menagerie guide if it ends up being relatively useful. And next up, because you know I have to talk about Tier 7, we have to mention it for those Thorum players out there, and heaven forbid Tier 7 just comes back. Reoccurring Nightmare is an 8/5 undead. Death Rattle, give a different friendly undead Death Rattle, summon a reoccurring nightmare. Yes, this thing can pop all over the board and keep coming back. Do they have a Titus Rivendare? Are they getting extra Death Rattle triggers? Have they reborn this thing? You could be looking at a board full of Tier 7 minions to end your turn, and it doesn't feel good. Typically, I don't see people who use this buff their undead army enough. Now, is this because they're just not lucky enough to find it? It's because they don't really think about it as mattering. But if you could summon 4, 10, 30 of these in a fight, and they're not buffed, they're just 8/5s, who cares? What if you put +25 attack onto them? All of them. Everywhere. It gets a little annoying. It is a never-ending combat that can drive you mad. And it is extremely frustrating. When I see boards with these running around, I'm picking up all the Sindori straight shots I can if I can help it, because I just don't want to deal with these. Cleaves are another good way to deal with these too, because it'll hit multiple targets, trying to limit where they're going to be landing, because once they're out of other minions, they can only land on reoccurring nightmares. They don't attach. They just disappear. They just land to everything but. That's the different part. One of my favorite things about this card was the poor voice lines, which we never get to have anymore because we heard them far too much, but I miss them so much.
Wakey, wakey, your nightmare is my dream.
Yeah, that was great voice work. I feel a little bad that we never get to hear that anymore because it felt so good when it was happening. That's the recurring nightmare. I definitely don't want to turn away from that if it's offered to me in a Tier 7 lobby. The only reason why I don't like minions like this is because it's turn 1 and you're committing to playing a reoccurring nightmare in the case of Thorum. I don't like that idea, but if it's a lobby because it's in the game again and I can just get it and I happen to be playing undead, the thing is a monster. All right, let's do it. Let us jump into the builds. Let's talk about the various ways we can make our undead board work. We know what the minions are, we know what their abilities are. How do we cobble it together and what might it look like? Undead can do a couple different variations. You know, there's always ways you can cobble on together your own unique build, but main ones we're gonna stick with, the primary builds. Let us start with the Eternal Night build. And this one's really easy. Now, basically, if you ever at any point during the game see yourself with a couple Eternal Nights, you might think to yourself, I could do this build. Now, if it's turn 3 or 4 and you got 2 of them, you definitely want to think, I could do this build. Do not say I am doing this build, because you will get to tier 6 and you will never see an Eternal Summoner again. Or you won't get the Kel'Thuzad and you won't get the other fun toys to make this build work. But definitely keep your eyes open. If you get 2 of these and you can start making it work, you definitely can really get your potential up there as you're tiering up. Because if you have 2 Eternal Nights, they are scaling themselves quite a bit during the duration of the game, thus giving you more value later. So we've got a clue we might be playing it, but when do we know we're playing it? In my mind, we're not playing it officially till we have at least 2 Eternal Nights and we start finding some reborn abilities. So we're looking for either Mummifier or Hateful Hag. The most important part of this build initially is the Eternal Night, but not necessarily when you could do this, because you also could just at one point early get an Eternal Summoner and start building it from there. But let's go with the assumptions you have Eternal Nights. If you have Eternal Nights, you're looking for Mummifiers and Hateful Hags. As you get up to that high tier and you triple into a 6, the most effective things you can find are either going to be the Eternal Summoner, that'll give you more Nights, or an Archlich Kel'Thuzad. Because then what you can start doing is you can just start printing more of them. Ultimately, what this build is going to look like, if you can help it, is going to be that you are going to turn from Eternal Nights, you're going to end up selling them, spitting them if you get the possibility to devour the spell them. And then you're going to replace all that with Eternal Summoners. Now, the reason for that is Eternal Summoner summons Knights, and then you don't have to have the Knights on your board. Now, that's great to initially have those Knights while you're transitioning, but if you get the Archlich Kel'Thuzad, you can use that same trick to then print additional Eternal Summoners. So you're going to be adding more of them until you triple them, and then so on and so forth. You're just going to keep going until your board is all golden Eternal Summoners, and you're all set. Then you're just good to go. How do you scale? Well, combat happens, your minions die, you don't care. With this build, you actually don't really need to worry about your undead army buff, because while it is nice to have it up, if the Eternal Knights are buffed enough, it doesn't matter. They're going to scale themselves during every combat, continuously getting bigger for you. Obviously, having the extra attack buff is nice if you have it, but it's not mandatory. So this build is really simple. So you just put it together and unleash it on your opponents. It can be quite fun. Well, the turns can be boring at times because you're like, well, I need Eternal Summoners. I already have the Kel'Thuzad. I already have the Eternal Knight. I already have a Mummifier. So I guess I'm just going to roll and then be done, and roll and then be done. And in some spells you can splash in, of course, but other than tech plays you can use to counter what your opponents are doing, turns are looking for Eternal Summoners. Now, the next build is one of my least favorite ways to play Undead, but it certainly does work and it can give you some decent stat lines, so always consider this one as an option. Also, and this is the Moroes Death Rattle build. So the way this works is you just play a normal game, and if at some point relatively early, no, you don't want to wait too late to find this, if you get a Kel'Thuzad and a Moroes, you might be able to put this package together. Basically what happens is you put Moroes in slot 1, you have Kel'Thuzad sitting in slot 2, and Kel'Thuzad keeps triggering at the end of your shop phase the Moroes, which will give all your undead minions a 2/4 buff. This buff, being a shop phase buff, is permanent, so you're going to scale up your board as quickly as possible with this, just triggering at the end of every shop phase. Another great way you can do this is if you have Titus Rivendare. Now you're triggering it twice, thus you're scaling your minions that much faster. Remember, if you go 6 minions, because Moroes has Reborn, that means you will get another permanent copy of this when the Kel'Thuzad triggers, thus allowing you to print triples. So just make sure you always have 6 minions and you'll always print an extra one of these. It is a very icky way to scale your board. It can be quite annoying if you hit it early enough. If you have the Titus, this little 3-card package you can put together really can scale your undead quite high. So what kind of minions do we want to flush this board out? We have our main pieces. What minions are going to make the rest of this work. So let's start with a utility angle. If you get a Drakari Enchanter, that is going to give you an extra trigger of your Kel'Thuzad, which is going to give you more stats. So you want to keep that in mind, that your board will be that much bigger, but at the cost of a minion that is not undead. So it depends how long you keep this on your board. I definitely wouldn't be too greedy with it, but if you're strong and you're feeling healthy, I would definitely have it for a little while. Now, if we're looking for something to give us just more raw attack, then I would be looking at something like Anub'arak, because Anub'arak can just sit there, scale up the attack of all these minions. Well, they're also getting their health and attack buffed by the Moroes. We've already established that you have a Titus, thus you're getting more value from the Anub'arak. And then Nightbane, the Ignited, will help fill this out even more, because Nightbane is getting buffed by the Moroes, who's triggering extra times because of the Titus. But then when Nightbane dies, it's going to get triggered extra time after having its stats permanently increased by the Moroes, just throwing more and more stats around. If you have a lot of Reborn, you should look for like Sister Deathwhisperer. That way, more stats. If you need Reborn, Mummifier, throw it out there, go nuts. Probably the last thing I would throw out there, if we've got enough attack raised, if we're just looking for additional summons, especially if we're running into giant statted minions without a whole lot of additional summons like dragons, Eternal Summoner's pretty good at breaking that up, because now you'll have a minion who's getting buffed permanently, who once again benefits from the Titus Revendare, and has additional summons and Reborn baked into them already, giving you just a pretty good advantage. The build itself has a lot of options. There's a lot of different ways you can go with it. But if we're just looking at that primary 3 minions, that's not too hard to get together. They're not super complicated what they're doing. Everything else is just what's the best fit for your board against your opponents. Finally, we're going to talk token undead. Token undead boards are really easy. You scale up their attack as much as possible, and then you unleash a horde of minions that summon more minions and eventually just tear your opponent down. So we're playing a random board. We don't have any tribe. How do we know when we're going to be playing this type of board? When does it raise its head and go, ooh, I should play this? And that is anytime you find a Anub'arak and you also have a token minion. So we're looking at Bonehead, we're looking at Handless Forsaken, anything along those lines that's summoning additional things. Hell, if it's early and you somehow have Eternal Summoner, same deal. But then again, just go Summoner build at that point. But Anub'arak plus tokens equals win if you have enough time. That's why I'm saying the earlier you get this, the better. So you get Anub'arak, you get the tokens. What else would flush out this? Well, this might surprise you, but Titus Revendare, doubling those death rattles of the Anub'arak, doubling those death rattles of the Handless Forsaken, of the Boneheads, are going to give you just more and more tokens that have been scaled up more and more to take out your opponent's larger minions. Also slower, but still a good fit if you have a bunch of summons already. If you haven't found that, Titus would be a champion of the Primus. Since you have so many tokens, odds are enough of them are going to die where this is going to buff up your attack a good bit. I like Anub'arak better because you can get Reborn on Anub'arak, just easier. You want Anub'arak to die, and when the champion of the Primus dies, it's painful because now you're not getting any benefit. So unless you get lucky with when you get champion of the Primus, I prefer Anub'arak, but an early champion of the Primus with enough summons can do the job and can carry you there quite easily with this build. Just as in the final form, towards the later part of the game, you definitely want to be cutting this minion because it just doesn't really fit in with what this board's going for. So we have the primary pieces of the build. Now what? What do we need to flush it out? Well, we're going to look for things like Mummifier. After that, we're going to be saying we need to make this Reborn permanent. So how are we going to make it permanent? It's either going to be Disguised Graverobber. That way it's going to destroy the Mummifier and then give one of your undead minions on your board Reborn. Disguised Graverobber's not undead, it's neutral, so that won't eat one, luckily. Then we're going to look for things like Butchering. Now, Butchering just destroys the Mummifier. You don't get anything back, but you do buff your attack, and as long as you know it's going to hit a minion that matters, that's not so bad. And later, but if you need to, Kel'Thuzad, because Kel'Thuzad will keep killing that Mummifier and get everything Reborn. That way, all your tokens, that way your Anub'arak have Reborn, and you're just monstrous. Now, you also obviously can splash in a Hateful Hag early enough. Hateful Hag will do the job. Problem with Hateful Hag is it has to swing to give Reborn, and it's got to be on your board. And it's not permanent. It's just this temporary buff. It's great early, but once again, later you want all this to be permanent. That way you can get the real value when you're fighting against boards that have just completely scaled to the roof. You're going to need this. So if your board's humming nicely, you know, you've got Anub'arak, you've got Handless Forsaken, you've got Titus, you've splashed Reborn across the board. What are the final things you want to look for? Cherry on top probably is Eternal Summoner, just because it has a scaling minion it summons. If you've busted the attack already a whole lot, this is going to benefit from that. If you have a Titus, it's going to benefit from that double death rattle. It does fit nicely into your board, but at the same time, you don't have to. You don't need to go dig this up. If everything's already got Reborn and enough attack, you could just sit there with your low tier happy minions and go nuts. And essentially that is it. You're just going to have this board full of tokens. You're going to have a ton of attack and you're going to roll over people. It takes a little while to get the hang of which ones to put in what order and which ones you actually want, but a lot of it comes down to luck of when you find them, who you're fighting, all when you get it, folks. Sometimes you can't win, sometimes it never shows up, and sometimes it all shows up in one turn. That's it. That's Undead. That's how they operate. That's the minions they have. That's all their abilities. That's our builds. I like Undead. I think they're fun. I definitely enjoy playing them. Sometimes I'm just not in the mood for them, and I don't know why. It's weird. They're a token board. I like the swarminess of it most of the time, and some days I'm like, I just want to put together a build and have fun. And sometimes it seems like a lot of work to plan and put everything in the right place and hope the hits go right and they don't take the counters to your board. It is just a lot to worry about with Undead. You have to position it all and have some good hits. When it works really well. But you have to have a little bit of luck. You don't usually just instantly high roll to the moon because most of it takes time to build up. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned a few things and I hope you had a good time. I'll catch you next time. Later.